We are taught that the White City of 1893 was a temporary illusion, a disposable stage set built of plaster and hemp in a Chicago swamp destined to vanish. But the official explanation collapses the moment you examine the physics. Zoom in on the photographic evidence. Look at the load-bearing masonry. Look at the atmospheric energy masts powering a grid larger than most modern cities. Does this look like a temporary fairground to you? Or does it look like a fully realized metropolis that we didn't build, but simply inherited? The fires that conveniently destroyed these structures weren't tragedies. They were the systematic erasure of a civilization that didn't fit the new narrative. We are living in the ruins of something greater. Once you see the pattern in the ashes, you can't unsee the reset. I wasn't looking for a conspiracy. I was looking for a logistics report. It started with a simple question about supply chains. If the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago covered 690 acres and featured over 200 massive neoclassical buildings, constructed in less than 2 years, where did the materials come from? The official story is that these buildings were constructed using a material called staff, a mixture of plaster of Paris, hemp fibers, and jute, hung onto wooden and steel frames. We are told it was cheap, fast, and temporary. A theatrical trick to fool the eye. But look at the manufacturers and liberal arts building. It was the largest building in the world at the time. It covered 30 acres. The Great Pyramid of Giza could fit inside it 3 times over. Its steel arches spanned 368 feet without a single supporting column in the center. Are we really expected to believe that 19th century laborers, working with horse-drawn wagons in the mud of Jackson Park, erected a steel skeleton of that magnitude, clad it in temporary plaster that perfectly mimicked the weathering and acoustic properties of marble, installed a fully functional hydroelectric grid, and dredged a canal system that rivaled Venice, all in 24 months? I tried to find the photographs of the construction, not the scaffolding going up. I mean the foundations. The deep excavations required to support steel arches of that weight in a swamp. The archive is strangely silent. We have thousands of photos of the finished product. We have photos of the crowds. But the photos of the process, the muddy, messy, chaotic reality of digging out a city from nothing, are scarce, staged, or missing entirely. And then there is the detail. Staff is a crude material. It is meant to be viewed from a distance. Yet the photographic plates from 1893 show statuary with veins carved into the hands. They show cornices with perfect geometric ratios. They show a level of finish that requires master stone carvers decades to achieve. If this was a temporary stage set, why did they build it with the precision of a cathedral meant to last 1,000 years? Unless they didn't build it. Unless they just restored it. But if you admit that, you have to answer the next question, the dangerous one, the one that explains the smoke. Why did it have to burn? Let's talk about time, because in investigation, time is the one variable you can't fake. The official records state that the ground was broken for the Chicago World's Fair in 1891. The gates opened in 1893. 2 years, 730 days. In that window, we are told they dredged a swamp, engineered a canal system to rival Venice, laid miles of underground electrical conduit, and constructed over 200 neoclassical behemoths. Look at the tools. Look at the mud. We see men with hand shovels. We see horses dragging timber. We do not see the industrial infrastructure required to move millions of tons of limestone, granite, and steel. If you show these photos to a modern project manager, someone who builds airports or hospitals, they don't marvel at the ingenuity, they laugh. They tell you it's a logistical impossibility. You cannot marshal that amount of material, process it, and assemble it to tolerant precisions of less than an inch in 2 years with horses. Unless the heavy lifting was already done. Unless the canals were already there, silted up and waiting to be dredged. Unless the foundations were already deep in the bedrock, waiting to be uncovered. And then there is the fire. We are told these buildings were fire traps. Wood and plaster, ready to go up like a matchbox. And indeed, they burned. But look closely at the aftermath. When a temporary model is consumed, it typically dissolves into fine residue. It shouldn't leave behind a massive framework of distorted, heavy-gauge industrial metal. Look at the remnants of the peristyle. Look at the structural beams of the manufacturer's building. The thermal energy required to reshape structural elements of that magnitude is profound. Can a localized event involving simple organic materials really reach the intensity needed to warp the core skeleton of a 30-acre structure? The conventional record attributes this to a historical accident during a period of civil unrest. However, the sequence appears remarkably precise. The events didn't just remove the structures, they removed the technical documentation of their origin. The blueprints? Unavailable. The material invoices for millions of tons of steel? Unaccounted for. The engineering schematics for the power plants? Lost in the aftermath. It begins to resemble a systematic removal of evidence rather than a simple misfortune. If a city's existence challenges the established timeline, it cannot be inhabited. Instead, it is framed as a fleeting exhibition. The public is taught to view it as a clever imitation. And once the exhibition concludes, the evidence is cleared away before the true nature of the materials can be verified. But Chicago wasn't an isolated incident. This wasn't bad luck, it was a protocol. Because 11 years later, they did the exact same thing in St. Louis, and then in San Francisco, and then in Buffalo. The pattern is global. The method is identical, and the silence is deafening. Let's pause the narrative for a moment and look at the raw mathematics of earth moving. Because while you can fake a photograph with retouching, you cannot fake the physics of friction and gravity. The 1893 Chicago Fair required the dredging of canals and the filling of the Jackson Park swamp. We are told this involved moving approximately 1.2 million cubic yards of earth. In 1891, the standard excavation tool was a slip scraper pulled by a team of mules. A slip scraper holds about 1/5 of a cubic yard of soil. Do the math. To move 1.2 million cubic yards with mule teams in the time frame alleged, you would need a coordinated army of tens of thousands of teams working 24 hours a day in perfect weather without creating a traffic jam that would paralyze the city. If the buildings are the shell of the mystery, the people inside them are the ghost in the machine. There is a disturbing feature present at almost every major World's Fair from the late 1800s to the early 1900s. It wasn't a ride. It wasn't a statue, it was an exhibit. They called it the infant incubator display. At the Chicago, Buffalo, St. Louis, and Omaha fairs, visitors paid 25 cents to walk through a sterile ward filled with glass boxes. Inside those boxes were premature babies. Living infants, the signs advertised, as if they were a sideshow attraction. The official narrative is that this was a medical miracle, a way to fund the technology of neonatal care because hospitals refused to adopt it. We are told these were premature babies from the local slums, saved by the benevolent Dr. County. But look closer at the photographs. These babies, thousands of them across different fairs, do not look like the frail, 2-pound preemies we see in modern NICU. Many are chubby, alert, full term. Where did thousands of babies come from, simultaneously, in every major city where a fair was held? And where were their parents? This phenomenon coincides perfectly with another historical anomaly of the 19th century, the orphan trains. Between 1854 and 1929, an estimated 250,000 children were transported from East Coast cities to the Midwest and West. They were loaded onto trains, shipped across the country, and given away on station platforms to anyone who would take them. Laborers, they were called. We are told this was a charitable movement to clear the streets of New York. But the timeline aligns too perfectly. You have massive, empty cities being dug out and refurbished as World's Fairs. You have a suspiciously high number of unclaimed infants being displayed in glass boxes at these very same fairs. And you have a mass transit system dedicated to shipping children into these exact territories. Was the reset not just architectural, but demographic? If a civilization ends, whether by war, disease, or catastrophe, and you want to repopulate the infrastructure without the memory of what came before. What do you need? You need a generation of children with no parents, no history, no oral tradition. You raise them in foundling asylums, buildings that look suspiciously like the fairground palaces. You show them the White City as a fantasy, a temporary dream. You teach them a new history in the standardized schools established in the same decade. The incubator exhibits weren't hospitals, they were hatcheries, and the world's fairs were the intake centers for the inheritors, the generation designed to inhabit the ruins without asking who built them. This creates a chilling context for the destruction that followed. Once the population was processed, distributed, and re-educated, the old world grandeur of the fairs had served its purpose. It was too grand for a working class. It asked too many questions. So the babies were sent to the farms via the orphan trains, and the palaces were sent to the torch. If the construction timeline is the smoking gun, the technology inside is the bullet. Look at the night. In 1893, most of America was still lit by gas lamps and candles. Rural electrification was decades away, and yet, in the middle of Jackson Park, the White City didn't just flicker, it blazed. We are told this was the debut of alternating current, the triumph of Westinghouse and Tesla, and certainly the patents exist. But look at the scale. The 1893 fair consumed 3 times more electricity than the entire city of Chicago combined. Think about the infrastructure required for that. Now, look up. What do you see on the roof of every single temporary palace? Spires, domes, needles. We are told these are decorative finals, ornamental flourishes to make the plaster look pretty. But look closer. They aren't random. They are geometric. They are metallic. They are grounded. To a modern electrical engineer, they don't look like decoration. They look like conductors. They look like atmospheric energy harvesters. We need to talk about the quality of the light itself. If you look at the colorization of the night photos from Buffalo 1901 or San Francisco 1915, the light isn't the warm, yellow tungsten glow of early Edison bulbs. It is a stark, piercing, ionized white-blue. This wasn't simple incandescence. This was plasma. The lighting systems used at these fairs utilized rare earth gases and mercury vapor technologies that were supposedly experimental. Yet they illuminated millions of square feet without flickering. The official history tells us that the fairs were powered by massive steam dynamos hidden behind the scenes. But were they generating the power? Or were they merely jump-starting the atmospheric harvesters? Consider the materials. The staff plaster on the buildings is interesting here. Plaster is a dielectric insulator. Steel is a conductor. A steel frame coated in plaster is, structurally speaking, a massive capacitor. It stores charge. When you look at the World's Fair in this light, it wasn't a display of electricity. It was a functional machine, a harvester of the aether. The water in the canals acted as the ground. The gold-leafed domes acted as the receivers. The buildings themselves stored the charge. Here is the darker possibility. The fairs weren't just about showing off new inventions. They were about cataloging old ones. What if the White City wasn't built to demonstrate what we could do, but to inventory what they had left behind? A massive, functional, atmospheric energy grid that pulled power from the ether, wireless, clean, and impossible to meter. And that is why it had to be destroyed. You cannot put a meter on atmospheric energy. You cannot charge a monthly subscription for the ether. If the population realized that the cathedrals and palaces they inherited were actually free energy power plants, the entire economic model of the 20th century, coal, oil, metered electricity, would collapse before it began. So they showed us the light, dazzled the world with it, claimed it was too expensive to maintain, and then, systematically, ruthlessly, they dismantled it. They tore down the towers and sold us the wire. If the fires were meant to erase the evidence, they failed. Because some of the temporary structures refused to die. Travel to San Francisco. Go to the Marina District. Stand in front of the Palace of Fine Arts, built for the 1915 Panama-Pacific Exposition. The official story is that this rotunda was built of staff, plaster, and fiber, meant to last 1 year. We are told that it was so beloved that the city decided to save it. They claim they spent decades reinforcing a temporary plaster structure until they eventually rebuilt it in concrete in the 1960s. Ask a structural engineer if you can reinforce a plaster decoration to stand for 50 years in the salt air and seismic instability without a steel and stone core. They didn't save a plaster model. They simply stopped trying to destroy a stone monument. Now go back to Chicago, the Museum of Science and Industry. This was the Palace of Fine Arts from the 1893 fair. It is the only major building from the White City that remains. Why? The official narrative says it was built of brick and steel to protect the valuable art inside, while the other 200 buildings were wood and glue. But look at the architecture. It matches the temporary buildings perfectly. The same columns, the same proportions, the same impossible scale. Are we to believe that in the middle of a rush job to build a disposable city, they decided to build one solitary fortress of eternal limestone that looks exactly like its plaster neighbors? Or is it more likely that all of them were stone? That the Palace of Fine Arts is simply the one they chose not to dynamite? And here is the cruelest irony. What did they put inside these surviving palaces? They turned them into museums. They used the inherited architecture of a lost civilization to house the textbooks that would write them out of history. They took the Palace of Electricity, a temple to atmospheric power, and filled it with displays of primitive steam engines and coal chutes. They took the Palace of Liberal Arts and filled it with pamphlets on the progress of the Industrial Revolution. They didn't just hide the past. They re-educated us inside its hollowed-out shell. The World's Fairs were not a celebration of the future. They were a graduation ceremony for a population that had been reset. A conditioning program to teach us that the magnificent stone world we inherited was actually just a temporary illusion, and that the ugly, smoke-belching industrial world of steel and brick was progress. And we believed them, because the fire took care of the counter-evidence. Once you see the pattern in Chicago, you see it everywhere. Paris, 1889. London, 1851. Buffalo, 1901. St. Louis, 1904. San Francisco, 1915. Different continents, different governments, different languages, and yet the same temporary neoclassicism, the same impossible construction timelines, the same massive hydraulic infrastructure, the same atmospheric spires, and almost always the same fire. The Crystal Palace in London, a marvel of glass and iron that predated modern skyscrapers by decades, burned to the ground in 1936. The San Francisco Fair, demolished to build a marina. The St. Louis Cascades, buried in a landfill. We are told this is the natural cycle of progress. Out with the old, in with the new, but walk through your own city tomorrow. Look at the post office. Look at the courthouse. Look at that old bank downtown with the oversized doors and the columns that seem too big for the street. Ask yourself, did we really build that with horses and buggies in 1890? Or is that just a leftover fragment of the World's Fair that never closed? They told us it was a dream. A fleeting moment of beauty in a dirty industrial age. But dreams don't leave behind millions of tons of limestone. Dreams don't require dynamite to dismantle. The World's Fairs weren't a dream. They were a memory. And the only way to make us forget was to burn it all down.